My name's Jake. I'm 33 now, but this story takes place just a few months after I turned 30, right around the time everything started slipping out from under me. I just lost my job at a mid-sized marketing firm after a massive round of layoffs. No fault of my own, my numbers were solid, and I had even closed a major client 2 weeks before the axe dropped. But it didn't matter. They were restructuring, and I wasn't essential. I remember packing up my desk in silence, watching the HR rep pretend she was sorry. But the real mess didn't begin there. It started when I made the decision to move back into my dad's house. I didn't have much of a choice. My savings were thin, rent in the city was laughably high, and job prospects were slow. My girlfriend had just broken up with me, claimed I was emotionally distant, while I was quietly drowning in stress. So that was another door closed. I figured my dad's place would be a temporary solution. Just a couple of months, tops. I'd stay in the basement, apply to jobs, and get back on my feet. That was the plan. I didn't expect it to turn into a slow-burn nightmare. Let me explain the family layout real quick. My dad, Alan, is 62, a retired contractor who somehow still acts like he's the only person in the world who's ever worked a real job. The kind of guy who believes a 101-degree fever means you're just being soft. And then there's my Aunt Karen. Yes, that's actually her name, who lives 2 streets over and pops in uninvited at least 3 times a week. She's never worked a day in her life, spent most of her adult years chasing pyramid schemes, and still thinks she's smarter than everyone else in the room. Together, they form what I can only describe as a smug, self-righteous feedback loop. And I was stupid enough to step into it. At first, it was little things. Comments that felt like paper cuts, small, but they kept adding up. I'd come upstairs to grab coffee in the morning, and Dad would be watching the news. "Still in your pajamas, huh?" he'd say without looking up. Or I'd mention a job interview I had scheduled, and he'd chuckle. "Better not mess this one up." Aunt Karen wasn't much better. She'd show up with grocery bags, act like she was doing everyone a favor, and then say something like, "Jake, you could at least help bring them in. You're not doing anything else." I bit my tongue at first. I figured it was stress talking. Maybe they were just old-fashioned, and I needed to give them some grace. But it kept going. It wasn't just passive digs anymore. It was like they were building a case against me. Every little thing I did was wrong. If I cooked dinner, it was too spicy. If I went for a run, it was, must be nice having so much free time. I couldn't win. And the worst part? They'd gang up on me. They fed off each other's disapproval like it was some kind of family sport. I tried staying out of the way. I kept to the basement, headphones in, resume open, staying productive. But I wasn't just dealing with unemployment. Something was going on with my body, something I couldn't quite explain. It started as tightness in my chest. Just a weird pressure at first, like someone sitting on my ribs. Then shortness of breath, especially when I went up the stairs too quickly. I chalked it up to stress. Maybe I wasn't sleeping enough. Maybe it was anxiety. I didn't want to sound dramatic. But there was one afternoon I'll never forget, because that's when the cracks really started to widen. I had just gotten off the phone with a recruiter who basically ghosted me mid-call. I went upstairs to grab a glass of water, and Karen was already there, sitting at the kitchen table, stirring her tea like a Victorian villain. Dad was fiddling with a wrench at the sink, pretending to fix something that had been broken for years. I reached for a glass, and Karen smirked. "Sleep well?" she asked, her tone as sweet as battery acid. I gave her a polite nod. "Yeah, thanks." "You know," she continued, "when your cousin Brian lost his job, he didn't just sit around moping. He started driving for Uber the next day. Didn't wait for the world to hand him something." Dad chimed in, not missing a beat. "Yep, Brian's a hustler. That kid doesn't make excuses." I wanted to say, Brian also doesn't have a collapsed lung, but I didn't know that yet. All I knew was that I couldn't breathe properly, and I felt like I was living in a fishbowl full of judgment. I smiled weakly and excused myself, pretending I had another interview lined up. As I walked back downstairs, my vision swam for a second. Just a brief flicker of dizziness. It passed quickly, but something told me to pay attention. Of course, telling my dad I didn't feel right was like telling a brick wall I needed emotional support. When I casually mentioned the chest tightness later that night, he snorted and said, "Maybe try doing a few push-ups once in a while. You're 30, not 80. Karen added, "Probably just heartburn from all that spicy food you cook. Try Tums." I nodded and dropped the subject, even though the tightness had moved to a burning sensation. I didn't want to seem weak. Not in that house. That weekend, my younger cousin Lindsay threw a birthday party for her toddler, and Dad insisted I come. Said it would be good for me to get out. Karen offered to drive, which meant I was stuck in the front seat with her commentary all the way there. So, she said, turning down the radio, any luck with the job hunt? Or are we still on vacation? I stared out the window. Sent out a bunch of resumes. Got an interview next week. That's what you said last week, she replied, voice laced with amusement. You know, Jake, not everything's about waiting for the perfect fit. Sometimes you have to take what you can get. I didn't respond. There was no point. The party was fine, balloons, cupcakes, chaos, but I started feeling winded after helping carry a folding table into the yard. I wasn't doing anything strenuous, just walking across grass, but I felt like I'd run a marathon. I leaned against a fence, trying to breathe, and my vision blurred again. Karen noticed. Oh, for goodness sake, she said, rolling her eyes. Don't be so dramatic. You act like you're dying. That hit me harder than I expected. I looked at her, mouth open, but no words came out. The tightness in my chest flared again, sharper this time. My fingertips tingled. I excused myself quietly and sat in the car until the party ended. No one asked where I went. The following week, things boiled over. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was upstairs looking for a screwdriver. I'd offered to fix the loose railing on the back steps, hoping it might earn me a scrap of goodwill. I was halfway up the stairs when the dizziness returned full force. My chest clamped down like a vice. I stumbled, catching the wall with one hand. Karen was in the living room. Dad was watching TV. I couldn't speak at first. I was too focused on not collapsing, but they noticed the noise. Dad turned. Jake, what are you doing? I tried to respond, but it came out like a gasp. Oh, come on, Karen said, waving a hand. He's doing that thing again, acting like he's got some mysterious illness just because life didn't go his way. I looked at my dad, pleading silently. He frowned, annoyed. Quit faking it, he snapped. I'm not in the mood for this today. I was shaking now, legs weak, hands numb. My breath caught in my throat like gravel. Someone muttered, probably Karen. Here we go again. And then everything blurred. I heard a neighbor shouting. A phone call. Sirens. The front door burst open. The EMT walked in, took one look at me, grabbed my wrist, and shouted, "We need a stretcher. Now." And just like that, the entire room, my dad, my aunt, the judgment, the mockery, collapsed into chaos. That was the moment everything changed. When I woke up, everything felt heavy, like I was underwater. The hospital lights above me buzzed faintly, and there was this steady beep echoing from somewhere near my left ear. My chest burned with every breath, and when I tried to move, something tugged at my arm, 4 tubes. For a second, I couldn't remember what had happened. Then it all came back in waves. The stairs, the dizziness, my dad yelling at me to stop faking it, my aunt's voice dripping with disdain. I turned my head slowly, and there they were, sitting side by side in the corner of the room like they were waiting for a dentist appointment, my dad and Aunt Karen. Dad had that same stony expression he always wore when something inconvenienced him. Karen looked bored, scrolling through her phone. "Oh," she said when she noticed me stirring. "You're awake." Her tone wasn't relief. It was more like she was annoyed I'd interrupted her scrolling. Dad leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "They said you passed out. Dehydration or something." I didn't say anything at first. My throat was dry and my head spun. The nurse came in before I could ask. She smiled, the kind of tired smile that only hospital staff can pull off. "You're lucky, Mr. Miller," she said gently. "Your oxygen levels dropped pretty low. If the EMTs hadn't arrived when they did, it could have been serious. Your lung collapsed, likely due to a spontaneous pneumothorax." I blinked, trying to process that. "Collapsed?" I croaked. She nodded. "Yes. It's rare, but it happens, especially with certain genetic predispositions or stress factors. You'll need to take it easy for a while." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my aunt raise an eyebrow. So it wasn't stress? The nurse gave her a look that could have cut glass. It was a physical medical emergency. Not something he imagined, ma'am. I wish I could say my dad looked remorseful. Shocked, maybe. But all I saw was discomfort, the kind you get when you're caught doing something embarrassing in public. "Well," he said after the nurse left. "Good thing you're all right. Maybe now you'll finally get some rest and stop overworking yourself." Overworking myself? I wanted to laugh, but it hurt too much. For the next 2 days, I stayed in that hospital room. Alone mostly. My dad and Karen stopped by once more, dropped off some takeout, and left after 10 minutes because the parking meter was running. My cousin Brian came by, though. He looked genuinely concerned, which, honestly, threw me off. We'd never been that close, but he'd heard through the family grapevine that I'd been hospitalized. Man, he said quietly, sitting by the bed. They didn't tell me it was this bad. I shrugged weakly. They probably think I'm being dramatic. Brian frowned. That's messed up. I mean, you literally couldn't breathe. Yeah. I smiled faintly. Guess that wasn't convincing enough. When I was finally discharged, the nurse gave me a long list of instructions: rest, follow-up scans, avoid stress, and no heavy lifting. I promised I would. But when I got back home, the air felt heavier than the hospital oxygen mask. Dad was in the living room watching sports. Karen was there too, as usual, eating chips like she owned the place. Well, look who's back, she said, her voice chirpy but laced with sarcasm. Our miracle patient. I ignored her and went straight to the basement. I thought maybe they'd treat me differently now. Maybe the near-death thing would shake some empathy loose. But within a week, everything went back to normal, or worse. Every morning, Dad would find some way to jab at me. You know, sitting around isn't going to make you better. Or, real men bounce back faster than this. Karen doubled down. You're milking it, Jake. Everyone gets tired sometimes. You can't use that as an excuse forever. One night, after dinner, I overheard them talking in the kitchen. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop. I was on my way up to grab some water, but their voices carried through the vent. Karen, he's taking advantage of you, Alan. I mean, he's 30. 30. You think it's normal for him to just sit in your house all day? Dad, I don't know what else to do with him. He says he's applying for jobs. Karen, yeah, and I say I'm a millionaire. Doesn't make it true. Dad, he's been through a lot. Karen, please. So have we all. The world doesn't owe him sympathy. Something inside me twisted. I wanted to barge in, but what was the point? They'd just call me sensitive again. Instead, I went back downstairs, sat on the edge of my bed, and just stared at the wall for a while. I was tired, not just physically, but emotionally hollow. The real breaking point came 2 weeks later. It was a Friday evening. I'd been working remotely with a small freelance client, just enough to cover groceries and phone bills. I felt good about it. For the first time in months, I had something resembling momentum. That night, I was supposed to have a follow-up appointment with my doctor. Dad had agreed to drive me since I still wasn't supposed to overexert myself. But when I came upstairs, dressed and ready, he wasn't there. Neither was the car. I called him. No answer. Then I texted, "Hey, are you still driving me? Appointment's at 6. No response. At 6:15, Karen texted me from her phone instead. Alan's helping me with something important. Reschedule your appointment. I stared at the screen. My chest tightened again, though this time it wasn't from my lungs. I called the clinic to explain and managed to push the appointment to the following week, but the embarrassment hit harder than I expected. I was 30 years old, stranded like a teenager, because my dad decided my aunt's something important was a priority. When they finally came home around 8, I was waiting in the kitchen. What was so important? I asked, trying to sound calm. Karen waved her hand. Relax. We were dealing with a situation. My neighbor's fence fell, and Alan knows his way around tools. Didn't want to bother you since you're still recovering. The way she said recovering made it sound like a punchline. Dad didn't even meet my eyes. You could have called an Uber. With what money? I shot back. You know I'm just starting freelance work again. He shrugged. Then you should have planned better. Something inside me snapped right there. All I do is plan. I said, louder than I intended. I've been trying to rebuild everything, and you treat me like I'm some lazy kid. I almost died, Dad. That wasn't fake. That wasn't some overreaction. And the minute I'm out of the hospital, you both start mocking me again like nothing happened. Karen stood up, crossing her arms. Don't raise your voice at your father. You're living under his roof. Show some respect. I turned to her, shaking. Respect goes both ways. Her smirk didn't fade. Oh, you poor thing. You think you've had it so hard? Try raising a family on one income during the recession. Try being responsible. I laughed bitterly. You've never worked a day in your life, Karen. That shut her up for a moment. Dad slammed his palm against the table. Enough. You don't talk to her that way. She's family. So am I said quietly. But you don't treat me like it. He glared at me, jaw tightening. Maybe when you start acting like a man, I will. I walked out. Not just out of the kitchen, out of the house. I didn't even grab a jacket. I walked around the neighborhood until my lungs protested again. I ended up sitting on a park bench, shaking from both anger and cold. That night, when I came back, they had locked the front door. My own dad had locked me out. I stood there, knocking softly at first, then harder. I could see the light still on in the living room. I knew they heard me. Finally, after 5 minutes, the door creaked open. Dad stood there, ice cold. "Don't wake the neighbors," he muttered. "You can come in, but don't pull that attitude again." I didn't say anything. I just went downstairs and shut the door behind me. Over the next few days, things got quieter, unnaturally so. Karen stopped showing up for a bit, which should have been a relief, but it only made me more uneasy. Dad barely spoke to me, except for clipped sentences about bills or chores. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Then, one morning, I woke up to find the basement door open, and my belongings half-packed into boxes. At first, I thought maybe Dad was reorganizing something. But then I saw the note taped to the wall, written in his handwriting. "Jake, Karen's friend has a place you can rent. You'll need to be out by Friday. I think it's time you learn to stand on your own 2 feet." I stood there, holding the note, my chest burning again, not from a medical condition this time, but from betrayal. I went upstairs, note in hand. Karen was already there, sipping coffee like she owned the house. Dad was silent, sitting beside her. "What is this?" I asked. She answered for him. "Alan and I talked. You've been here for months, and it's not healthy. You're too comfortable. You need a push." I stared at her. "A push? You think this is helping?" She smiled faintly. "Sometimes tough love is the best kind." Dad wouldn't look at me. I realized then that this wasn't just about money or space. It was about control, about pride. My illness, my effort, my pain, none of it mattered. They just couldn't stand seeing me vulnerable. That Friday, I packed my things quietly. Karen hovered nearby, supervising. She even commented on what I chose to take. "You don't need that old laptop, do you? It's practically junk." When I got to my car, she said, "You'll thank us one day." I didn't respond, but in my head, something hardened. Because I knew, deep down, they'd just handed me the motivation I'd been missing. And one day, they'd regret it. Badly. When I drove away from my dad's house with the last of my things stuffed into the back seat of my aging Civic, I didn't feel angry. Not at first. I felt empty, numb, like someone had just erased the last page of my story and left me staring at a blank one. It was raining, of course, the kind of slow drizzle that creeps into your shoes and your bones. I pulled over 2 blocks away and just sat there for a while, forehead against the steering wheel, listening to the soft rhythm of water tapping on the roof. My whole life, I had this quiet belief that if I did the right thing, worked hard, treated people decently, didn't make a fuss, life would meet me halfway. But apparently, it doesn't work like that. Karen's friend, the one who supposedly had a place for me, turned out to be a woman who rented out a decaying attic room above her garage. No insulation, shared bathroom, and she charged more than my freelance income could cover. I thanked her politely and left. For 3 days, I lived in my car, parked behind a 24-hour diner where I could sneak in and buy a coffee every few hours to avoid looking suspicious. I told myself it was temporary, just a weird blip in the timeline. But then the freelance client I'd been working with suddenly stopped responding. I emailed. I followed up. Nothing. The invoice I'd sent remained unpaid, and I didn't have the energy to chase them down. My chest ached constantly, but I pushed through it, telling myself it was just healing pain. Rock bottom wasn't loud. It wasn't some dramatic breakdown or a big fight. It was sitting in that car at 2 a.m., phone battery dying, hungry, sweaty, and too ashamed to call anyone. I had friends, not many, but good ones, and I knew at least 2 of them would have helped if I'd asked. But I couldn't. Something about that kind of vulnerability felt too raw, like I'd be confirming everything Karen had ever said about me. So I made a plan. I found a battered co-working cafe on the edge of town that offered unlimited coffee, power outlets, and, most importantly, a bathroom. I used it as my base of operations during the day. I applied for jobs, updated my portfolio, reached out to old clients, even posted on a couple of freelancing boards asking for leads. At night, I'd rotate where I parked to avoid suspicion. A grocery store lot, a church parking lot, a park near the lake. The funny thing is, that period, as humiliating and bleak as it was, stripped away all the noise. I had nothing left to distract me. No fake politeness. No smug relatives offering tough love. Just me and the silence. And for the first time in months, I started hearing myself again. One morning, I checked my inbox and found a message from a small tech startup based in Portland. They'd seen my portfolio on a design forum I barely remembered posting to. The founder, a guy named Evan, said he liked my work and needed someone to redesign their branding for an upcoming launch. It wasn't huge money, but it was something. More than something, it was validation. We hopped on a Zoom call that afternoon. I wore the one clean button-down I had and took the call in the cafe's back corner, praying the Wi-Fi would hold. Evan was chill, mid-30s, smart, humble, and he didn't care that I didn't have a fancy agency name behind me. He wanted results. I promised him results. For 2 weeks, I poured everything I had into that project. Slept in the car. Ate granola bars. But I designed like my life depended on it, because it did. I delivered early, added a few extras, and Evan was blown away. "You ever think about working full-time remote?" he asked. I blinked. "Are you offering?" "Let's talk," he said. By the end of that month, I had a contract. A real one. With benefits. A starting salary that nearly matched what I'd made at the marketing firm. And the best part? I could work from anywhere. The first thing I did was find a studio apartment. Tiny, yes, but clean, with its own bathroom and a window that let in real light. I signed a short-term lease and moved in with a single duffel bag and a sense of cautious hope. The second thing I did was go to a doctor. A proper follow-up. Got scans, tests, everything. Turns out the lung was healing okay, but the stress had caused lingering inflammation. I was given medication and told to take it easy. I actually listened this time. Over the next few months, I rebuilt myself piece by piece. I started exercising again, light stuff at first. Walks, yoga from YouTube videos. I started reading, not job listings, but books I actually liked. I reconnected with my college friend Jonah, who invited me over for game nights. I even adopted a cat from the shelter, scrappy little thing with a torn ear and a mean stare that softened over time. I named her Olive. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. And here's the thing no one tells you. Once you stop trying to prove your worth to people who never saw it in the first place, life gets quieter, clearer. But then, 6 months in, I got a text. From Karen. "Karen, hi Jake. Hope you're doing well. Quick question. Do you still have your dad's old tax forms? He's being audited and needs help organizing things." I stared at the screen for a long time. Not because I was surprised, I wasn't, but because it was so brazen, so completely lacking in context or apology. "No, how have you been?" "No, we're sorry for how we treated you. Just a request." I didn't respond. The next day, my dad called. I let it go to voicemail. "Jake, I know things got tense, but we need to talk. Karen says you might have some of my paperwork. Call me back." Still, no apology. I sat in my new living room, cat curled up on my lap, and realized something important. They hadn't changed. They'd just run into a problem I could help with. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel obligated. I wasn't the struggling son in their basement anymore. I was someone who'd crawled through mud and made it out clean. And they hadn't even noticed. But they would. Oh, they absolutely would. Because that quiet strength I'd built wasn't just for me. It was the fuel for something bigger. Something calculated. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to fight. I was going to show them exactly what happens when you write someone off too soon. And the next phase? That's where things started to get interesting. I didn't reply to my dad's voicemail. Not the next day, or the one after. I knew he expected me to cave. To be the good son, again, quiet, compliant, helpful even when hurt. That's how it always worked before. But this time, I didn't feel guilt. I felt clarity. They didn't want me back in their lives unless I was convenient, useful. And that meant one thing. I had leverage. The silence stretched for a week. Then 2. I kept working. The startup gig was going great. Evan, the founder, was thrilled with my designs and even let me take point on a few new product features. I was learning fast, gaining confidence, and most importantly, I was saving money. More money than I ever had before. One afternoon in early spring, Evan messaged me on Slack. "Evan, random question. You ever think about investing in something bigger? Like starting your own agency or studio?" At first, I laughed it off. Me? Run a studio? But Evan wasn't joking. "I've worked with enough agencies to know when someone has that spark," he said on our next call. "You've got it. You care more than most of them. And you know what people like your dad never get? Caring is a superpower. That word, dad, made something tighten in my chest. I hadn't told Evan anything, but somehow he still managed to strike the exact nerve. That night, I stayed up late sketching on my whiteboard. Not designs, plans, connections, names, a web of ideas and intentions, all pointing toward one thing: revenge. Not the petty kind. Not fire and drama and screaming matches. I didn't want to burn bridges. I wanted to build something so high they'd choke on the view from the bottom. So I started with information. My dad's voicemail had mentioned taxes. That gave me a thread. I logged into the shared family Google Drive that I hadn't touched in years. He never changed the password. Classic. Inside the finances folder were old scanned tax documents, PDFs of receipts, and one spreadsheet ominously titled Rental Income 2013 to 2021. Rental income? I opened it and felt my stomach drop. Rows and rows of numbers. Addresses. Payment logs. Tenant names. All tied to properties I had never known my dad owned. I'd thought he just lived in our old house and lived off his retirement. Turns out, he was sitting on a small empire of rental properties, 7, to be exact, and raking in money for almost a decade. That explained the paid-off truck. The sudden, helping Karen with projects excuse. The extra spending. And the worst part? I saw my name on one of the tenant logs. From 2 years ago. $600 per month. I hadn't paid rent. I hadn't been charged rent. But there it was, my name, listed as a temporary occupant, with rent logged for each month I lived there after the layoff. He'd been reporting fake rental income under my name, probably to pad his losses elsewhere or hide money from taxes. That was it. The moment my forgiveness died. This wasn't just about disrespect. This was fraud. And he'd done it with my name. I spent the next few weeks collecting evidence. Quietly, methodically, I downloaded everything, cross-referenced it with property records, tracked the addresses, the tenants, the paper trail. I found one building still under his name, but listed under a shell company. And guess who was registered as the silent partner, without even knowing it? Me. He'd used my name for that too. At first, I thought about going to the IRS, reporting everything, burning it all to the ground. But I held back, not out of mercy, out of patience. Because the thing about revenge is, timing is everything. And mine was coming. In the meantime, I needed allies. So I reached out to the one person in the family who'd always treated me like a human being, my cousin Brian. We hadn't talked much since the hospital visit, but I sent him a text asking if he wanted to grab a drink. He replied within 5 minutes. We met at a dive bar just off the highway, quiet, low lighting, neutral territory. Brian walked in wearing his usual jeans and hoodie, offered a half smile, and said, "You look good, man. Better than before." I nodded. "Yeah, I feel better. A lot better." He took a sip of his beer and leaned forward. "So this about your dad?" I smiled. "Partly, but it's about a lot more than that." I told him everything. Not just about the collapse and the hospital and the way I'd been pushed out, but about the documents I found. The shell companies. The fake rental logs. The silent partner trick. Brian's jaw tightened. "He used your name?" "Multiple times," I said. "And he's not even being careful about it." He shook his head slowly. "That's not just shady. That's illegal." "I know. And Karen? She knows." I laughed. "Please." She probably told him to do it. Brian took a long sip and set his glass down. "So what do you want to do?" I met his eyes. "I want them to see what happens when you gamble on the wrong person. I want them to regret ever using me." He didn't hesitate. "I'm in." Turns out, Brian had his own history with Karen. Years ago, she'd borrowed a few grand from him to pay for her daughter's tuition, money that mysteriously disappeared the same month her kitchen got remodeled. He'd never seen a cent back. We formed a plan. Step 1 was securing a paper trail. With Brian's help, I reached out to a friend of his who worked in real estate, someone who could verify ownership records and provide clean, notarized copies of the title transfers. We confirmed everything: the properties, the shell company, the tax filings. All tied to Dad. All with my name somewhere it shouldn't be. Step 2 was getting ahead of the narrative. I didn't want to just expose him. I wanted to own the story. So I created a website. Clean, professional, anonymous. On the surface, it was a design portfolio, but hidden within it was a locked page labeled Inheritance. That page held the files, the receipts, the scanned documents, screenshots, everything. It was password protected, but it existed, and I had the power to send it to anyone I chose. Step 3 was leverage. One of the properties on that spreadsheet, a duplex in a nearby neighborhood, had a tenant listed as vacant for nearly a year. But property tax records showed a steady line of utility payments. Someone was living there, possibly under the table. I drove by one afternoon and saw a car in the driveway, a beat-up sedan with expired tags. I knocked on the door. A young woman answered, holding a baby. She was nervous at first until I explained who I was and what I'd found. "He's been charging you rent off the books?" I asked gently. She nodded, clutching the baby closer. Said it was a handshake agreement. "Cheaper this way. Has he ever given you a lease?" "No. I tried to get one once, and he said not to worry about it, that he'd handle the paperwork." I handed her a card with the website URL and password. "I think you should take a look at this. And if anyone threatens you, call me first." She stared at the card, then at me. "Why are you helping?" I smiled. "Let's just say I'm tired of him getting away with everything." As the weeks passed, I gathered more. Little details. Patterns. I even found an old voicemail Karen had left me last year, where she admitted to managing things behind the scenes for my dad's property accounts. It wasn't explicit, but it was enough to suggest complicity. Then, like fate was smiling at me, I got an invitation. A wedding. Karen's daughter, Lindsay, was getting married in June. They were throwing a big party, open invite for all the family, at a vineyard they couldn't possibly afford without Dad's help. And that's when I knew. The opportunity had finally arrived. One night, I opened the wedding website. Karen had included a family photo tribute section, old pictures of Lindsay, grandparents, cousins. There, buried in the back, was a photo from my childhood, me and Lindsay and Karen and Dad at a lake. My name was miscaptioned as Brian. I stared at it for a long time. Then I smiled, because I'd be attending that wedding. With a gift. Not a toaster, not a check, but something they'd never forget. The morning of the wedding, I woke up earlier than usual. The air was cool, the kind that feels crisp enough to cut through any leftover doubt. Olive, my cat, was asleep at the foot of the bed, purring softly, completely unaware that today wasn't just another Saturday. Today was the day I stopped being the family scapegoat. The vineyard was about an hour's drive from my apartment. As I pulled up, I could already see Karen's fingerprints all over it. Every detail screamed performative luxury. White roses, gold-trimmed tablecloths, string lights that looked like they belonged in a home decor catalog. She'd turned the whole thing into a stage, and for once, I didn't mind. I had every intention of stealing the show. I wasn't invited, technically, but Karen's family had always been the kind that cared more about appearances than boundaries. A late RSVP under guest of Brian Miller had slipped right through the cracks. And Brian, bless him, had texted me earlier that morning. "Brian, you sure about this?" Me, more than ever. "Brian, then I'll be near the bar. If things go sideways, I'll distract them." We'd planned every detail down to the minute. My revenge wasn't going to be loud. No shouting match, no overturned tables. Just quiet truth, spoken in the right room, at the perfect moment. The ceremony went by in a blur of forced smiles and champagne toasts. Karen was in her element, parading from table to table, telling anyone who would listen how proud she was of her daughter and how family is everything. Every word made my skin crawl. My dad stood beside her in a sleek suit, trying to look noble. He saw me once from across the courtyard, blinked in surprise, and then quickly looked away. When dinner ended and the speeches began, I made my move. While Karen was basking in attention near the microphone, I slipped away toward the event coordinator's booth, a little tent behind the main hall with a soundboard and a laptop connected to the projector system. Earlier that week, Brian and I had paid a quiet visit to the venue. He'd told the coordinator we were part of the video team and needed to test some visuals. We'd uploaded a short, 2-minute slideshow labeled Family Tribute, Backup. Except it wasn't a tribute. I stood behind the booth, waited for the cue, Karen's toast, and gave the coordinator a small nod. He clicked play, thinking he was starting the tribute reel she'd asked for. The lights dimmed. The guests turned toward the big screen. The first image that appeared was innocent enough, an old photo of Karen holding baby Lindsay. Then one of Dad, hammer in hand, building something in the yard. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Then came the next slide. A spreadsheet. Rows of numbers. Property addresses. The title, Rental Income, 2013 to 2021. At first, people thought it was some kind of joke. Then another slide, a tax document with Dad's name, and under co-owner/dependent, Jake Miller. Murmurs started spreading. Confused faces. Then the next slide showed an image of a bank transaction labeled Cash Deposit, Shell Holdings LLC. The final one? A scanned screenshot of the Shell company registration form, listing both Alan Miller and Jake Miller as partners. My name. My father's fraud. Publicly displayed under a glowing chandelier. Karen froze mid-sentence. Her smile dropped so fast it was almost comical. Dad's face drained of color. And then, silence. The kind that swallows an entire room. Karen stormed toward the booth, heels clicking like gunfire. "Turn that off," she hissed. "Turn it off right now." But before she could reach me, Brian intercepted her, stepping neatly into her path. "You might want to let it play," he said calmly. "There's more." The slideshow ended, replaced by a simple black screen with white text. Some inherit money. Others inherit debt. I inherited lies. Then, fade out. The lights came back up. The crowd was stunned. Lindsay, the bride, looked mortified. Her fiancé's family whispered behind folded hands. One of the groomsmen muttered, "What the hell was that?" Dad was the first to move. He pushed through the tables toward me, face flushed, jaw tight. "What did you do?" he barked, voice low but venomous. I met his stare evenly. Told the truth. "You think you can humiliate me like this?" I tilted my head. "I didn't humiliate you, Dad. You did that yourself when you used my name for your dirty business." Karen joined in, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You've ruined everything. Do you have any idea what this day meant for our family?" I let out a dry laugh. "Yeah, I do. It was about appearances, right? About pretending to be perfect. Well, congratulations. Now everyone gets to see the real picture." Security moved in after that, but not before I delivered the final blow. I handed Dad an envelope I'd been carrying since morning. "By the way," I said quietly, "you'll want to open that before the IRS does." He snatched it from me, ripped it open, and froze. Inside was a printed letter from an attorney. Not mine, technically, Brian's friend who specialized in real estate law, outlining the upcoming audit request that had already been filed anonymously, along with a neat list of properties, transactions, and discrepancies. His hand shook as he read. Karen's face went pale as she peeked over his shoulder. I leaned in just close enough for only them to hear. "You shouldn't have faked my name. You shouldn't have locked me out. And you really shouldn't have assumed I'd stay weak forever." Then I walked out. The aftermath unfolded faster than I expected. Within a week, my father's properties were under review. Tenants were interviewed. The vacant duplex occupant, the young mother I'd spoken to, came forward with proof of cash payments. Investigators uncovered thousands in undeclared income. And when they realized my name had been attached to several filings without consent, the case escalated. I didn't need to press charges. The system did it for me. Karen tried to spin it, of course. She told everyone I'd gone rogue, that I'd hacked into family documents. But that story fell apart when emails surfaced, the one she'd sent my dad discussing creative bookkeeping. By the end of the summer, my father's accounts were frozen pending investigation. He sold his truck to cover initial legal fees. The man who once mocked me for being too soft now had to borrow money from the same relatives who used to praise him. Karen disappeared from social media entirely. Lindsay's marriage barely lasted 3 months. Her husband's family wanted nothing to do with the scandal. And me? I moved forward. Evan, my boss, offered me a promotion. "You've got grit," he said during our next call. "Most people would have folded. You built yourself back from nothing." I didn't tell him the whole story. Some parts are better left unspoken, but I thanked him. I also expanded my freelancing portfolio, quietly turning it into a small design collective. Within a year, I had 3 people working under me. Brian even joined as a consultant. We called it Second Wind Studio. A fitting name, I think. I didn't hear from my dad for almost a year. Then one night, out of nowhere, I got an email. The subject line, "I'm sorry." It was short, barely a paragraph. He said he'd lost most of his savings, that he was trying to rebuild. He said he missed me, that maybe one day we could talk. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I closed the laptop. Because I realized something. Forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. And closure doesn't always require conversation. The next morning, I went for a walk by the lake, the same one from that old family photo. The air was calm, And for once, so was I. The past had burned itself out. All that remained was quiet peace. As I watched the sun rise over the water, I thought about everything I'd lost, everything I'd rebuilt, and everyone who'd tried to break me. Then I smiled. Because in the end, the sweetest revenge wasn't the downfall I caused. It was the life I built after. And I never looked back again.